also.
But great.
Okay.
Great. So we're here with Dan Winters. Dan graduated with honors from University of Detroit and pursued a graduate study in psychophysiology and the origin of language. In addition to his academic background, he has worked as a systems analyst with IBM, an industrial metallurgist, and a crystallographer. And he's undertaken many diverse studies from quantum physics to modeling at the MIT Space Lab to developing early biofeedback prototype equipment as Dr. Albert Axe's protege. His theories in coherent emotion inspired the notable research at Millard Fillmore Hospital in Buffalo and the HeartMath Institute in California in the mid-90s. And the results published by Dr. Glenn Rain provided conclusive evidence supporting Dan's heart entrainment theories. The effect of coherent ordering of the heart harmonics during the feeling of compassion was measured replicably, affecting the braiding and the programming of DNA. And so we're here with Dan Winters, and how you doing, Dan?
Just great. That sounded good. And yourself?
I'm doing great. I feel really blessed to have you here on the show, or on my channel, I should say. And I feel like you're coming to the table with such significant information. I felt I needed to reach out to you and make your information more heard. The significance, I feel, of what Dan has to share is profound in the sense that I feel like it really helps to answer some of the most difficult philosophical questions of all time, namely, what are we and what are we here for? And the reason why this is so important is because the answer to these questions, I feel, gives our life meaning. It's the story that we tell ourselves and our understanding of our place in the universe and in the spiritual, in context of the spiritual worlds, that really give meaning to our lives. And I feel like, this is a story and an understanding that used to be a narrative given by religion. But through, especially in the last 100 years, we've kind of lost that story to a mainstream science narrative that is quite disempowering, I would say.
Or even sometimes soulless.
Soulless, exactly, right? It's reductionist in it, and I feel like the result of that has led us to a disposition of overwhelming nihilism and lack of purpose. And so, to start off, what I want to ask, Dan, is how is the new physics that you and other people are a pioneer of? How is this bridging science and spirituality in a way that helps tell us a new story about ourselves and what our purpose is as humans?
Well, as you know, recently we have taken up the banner, which is becoming famous in conventional medicine, in fact, that cold plasma is profoundly therapeutic. And as in our Therify.net, which is our plasma tech rejuvenating in 20 countries, pretty cool, and it's working, and it proves the physics. And that sort of suggests something else, that what are we doing? We're feeding the aura. Well, what is your aura? Well, it is your cold plasma. And is that what spirituality has been calling your ghost or your spirit or your soul for how many 100 years? And in fact, it appears we can measure where that goes at the time of death. So in fact, the ability to feed your aura, what the Egyptians called fa'atun, feed atun, from which we get our word fatten, is in fact a sense of purpose, because if we understand what our aura is accomplishing and how it survives death and what goes through death, we in fact get a sense of our own immortality from conventional physics that in fact confirms spirituality in a beautiful way, and possibly provides an antidote to the desperate, as you say, nihilism or soullessness of a culture which is increasingly mechanical and artificial intelligence, and let's all be machines, and isn't that cool? And oops, where does compassion and spirit enter a machine? It doesn't. So if we realize the importance of feeding auras as scientists, we suddenly can discover more about the purpose of the human condition, and I'm about that, yes.
Absolutely. So let me double click a little bit on that. So you're talking about, our own immortality and an understanding that our plasma is what we have long called our ghost, and that there's scientific validation for that idea, and that immortality is the ability to continue to inhabit this plasma with our consciousness past the point of death. And how does this understanding affect, through this understanding, how can we understand how our decisions that we make today in the world affect not only our individual destiny, but the destiny of the collective and the cosmos?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for asking the right question. Not only can you determine which broccoli you should eat or who you should kiss by deciding whether it makes your aura bigger or smaller, but you can also decide whether you're going to expose yourself to Wi-Fi and 5G and electrosmog based on the depth of your aura. If you understood the physics of what actually makes you vital and immortal and what you take through death, you literally can do what Kurt Vonnegut had difficulty with in Breakfast of Champions, which was asking the question over breakfast, which was whiskey, which is what are people for? And people are actually for this possibility of gaining the kind of aura which is potentially immortal and sustainable. So actually, the tragedy, and I do mean tragedy for modern physics, is not understanding how a cloud of charge named plasma could in fact be self-aware or negentropic or self-organizing or mindful, as it were. So once physics gathers the idea that a cloud of charge, and remember physics is absolutely clear that plasma is 99.999% of the universe, and all of the plasma universe physicists, virtually all of them now believe in angels. So once you discover how a cloud of charge named plasma, and it can be cold if the source of that plasma charge is negentropic or conjugate or centripetal or implosive, suddenly you get an idea, tornadoes have eyeballs and clouds of charge becomes, the cloud of charge plasma between the two plasma tubes of Therify.net, all the therapists agree that that cloud of charge behaves like a pet kitten or puppy dog, and it needs to like you, and you need to treat it like it's mindful. And in fact, actually, if you ever get to know any elementals, they're the same way, And even the ones people are studying orbs are beginning to get it. And when Korotkov studied by measurement, where your ghost goes after death, and we know when it leaves your body and why and where it goes after death, goldenmean.info/immortality. And remember, you can discover the presence of the ghost by simply measuring for the cold spot, which is the implosion point. So suddenly now we understand exactly what a ghost needs after death, and it's good physics, which is simply the place of charge implosion, what Castaneda meant as the place of power. And what that, or otherwise defined as sacred space, or the place where charge distribution is efficient, like where Korotkov measured where the Kokis go to telephone ancestors, measuring the fractality of the air called heaven or Hey Ave, which is simply charge distribution efficiency. So, ancestor phone calls and the good place to die is all magnetic line cross points where you get longitudinal embedding and therefore DNA radio. So what the ghost needs after death, and by the way, Therify seems demonstrably useful for delivering ghosts, is very simple. It needs the place of implosion where it can gain enough centripetal inertia to gain distribution of charge named Hey Ave, heaven, or planes of Charon, which is the infinite dielectric charge field around gold, for example. So what the physics appears to be, and I do mean the hard physics, is that place where magnetic lines cross, we used to call sacred space, where every cathedral was located, and every labyrinth and every druid phone call and every cozy rev mirror, and the exact same place where Kathy measured a reduction in nuclear critical mass, where longitudinal embedding is enabled, is the place where the phase conjugate pine cones kiss noses and the transverse EMF is broadcast through the Planck threshold into the superluminal longitudinal EMF, which is the only mechanism of action at a distance in conventional physics, which describes every single physics of spiritual tradition, from communion of saints to ancestral memory to DNA radio to and song lines and dreaming tracks. It's all about longitudinal propagation. So we know what heaven is, and we know where that distribution of immortality comes. And so if you get your aura coherent enough, which in Egypt was called the Ba from the Ka, where the Ka was the amount of coherence in your aura, your boat into the underworld, and the Ba was pushed out like a seed from the Ka, which we now know is where the longitudinal propagates from the coherent transverse down the pine cone. And that Ba was your soul. I mean, that was the Egyptian word for soul, which now we can study as physics by understanding longitudinal electromagnetic propagation from phase conjugate embedding. So suddenly now we can answer our children when they say, what are people for? If you get centripetal enough, not only is the ghost saved, but we now know exactly why. It's well documented. Successful death experience produces visions that are electrically contagious, as Ray Moody has proven with so many surgeons. And we know why a successful charge implosive black hole is necessary for successful death, and we can design a place to do it electrically, and it's the opposite of a modern hospital. So we've learned a lot of things by studying the science of spirit. I'm pretty proud of it, actually.
Yeah, as you should be. I mean, this really is, it brings context to life and the afterlife, which brings purpose to our lives. And, that's why I felt like, bringing you on was so important. Now to further clarify a little bit more about humans' place in the universe or the cosmos, I've heard you speak about the connection between this process that you're talking about, so the imploding the blood, and our relationship with celestial bodies, namely stars. And so to bring more of the story of what humans are, the way I kind of interpreted some of it was that almost as if the earth is a kind of garden, and we are in a sense a kind of, or can grow to be a kind of food. And so if you could talk a little bit about that, I think that can bring some context to the cosmos and our place here on the planet.
Right. Well, remember, we often start at the place where Bill Tiller, so famously as a world famous physicist in his famous book, Conscious Acts of Creation, measured that focused human attention causes electric fields to compress or implode. It's very measurable. So the amount of beingness you have, literally your power as a shaman, as a being, is how charge implosive you are. That's measurable. It's real. It describes how you steer tornadoes, but it also describes how you get immortal. Now, if we somewhat state the obvious that, the biggest plasma ball in our neighborhood, and obviously therefore the most intelligent, is the sun, and it's been measured 11 different times that when millions of children sing the same song, the number of solar flares decreased dramatically, obviously providing strong evidence that we can make something centripetal enough to inhabit our star. And we know that every single religion that ever stood the test of time says the only gods worth talking to are called sun gods, and the Catholic religion is just one example of a sun god religion. And that the Egyptians described the physics correctly, that of Osiris, Enki, green face on every statue, did not inhabit the sun, then the Nile wouldn't flood on time. And they knew the physics very well. The solar flare periodicity was the precipitation gradient, and Tutankhamun inherited the ability to make rain because of their yearning. That's an old story. So it's obvious stars like our sun do not make DNA for a haphazard reason. We can potentially make something centripetal enough that feeds our star. Actually, we believe that the plasma centers of stars and black holes fundamentally need potentially the centripetal force that we collectively can make as plasma. However, where I would take this next would be a little bit of the ET context part of this story. Is that too scary, or what do you think?
Oh, I'm all about the ETs. Yeah, that's been a deep interest of mine for a long time. So yeah, we can definitely go there if that's where it's taking us.
We don't want to scare us away, but I think most scientists now are agreeing that it's absurd with the billions of inhabitable planets in our universe that obviously there are large numbers of intelligent species around. So that's obvious to every advanced scientist today. Now, we have many personal contacts with those in communication with these ETs, and I've been researching this for 30 years. And, you know, David Wilcox is somewhat famous for this in the Ancient Aliens series, so they're getting close. And David Wilcox calls the neighborhood here inhabited by what he calls the blue sphere beings. He doesn't seem to be aware that that's in fact the Andromedans, who are quite literally blue. And I had been talking to Alex Collier, famous for years, who had pioneered communication with the Andromedans. Their mystics named Morine and Visayas or Vesuvius. And recently we have another Pleiadian communicator, which we're quite close to here in France. We shall call a mediator, who surprisingly came through with more very, very detailed stories from these same Andromedans, and told us the story of Asket and the Simjasi, the Pleiadian sort of warrior women. And apparently there's a large number of these Andromedan spheres containing sheltering Pleiadian ships, for example, hidden behind the moon, a very large craft named Vieja. And it doesn't really matter if you believe these things, but I would like to get to a storal of the Mori here. And the storal of that Mori, in the context of what we're just saying about what are people for, is as follows. These Pleiadian and Andromedan, very mixed culture, are quite dedicated to freeing the Earth from what they call dominating parasites that we would call reptilians. They call them Kingu. There's three, right, white, red, and green, I believe, and they have different functions. But basically they are reptilian, largely underground, and they've been reported for thousands of years. It's a well-known story, and they're highly parasitic to humans. But what should be shocking and humbling to the humans is to realize that these cultures, Andromedan, Pleiadian, and others, regard the human species of Earth as not even having a culture, because we have been so parasited by these dominant reptilians, locally actually, and they're quite dedicated to, as it were, freeing us. But in the meantime, they are advising us what actually is our kind of, you might say, trump card in this game of who shall lead the Earth into survival. And the human condition, our trump card, is absolutely not our technology. Our technology is crap. It's childish, it's immature, and scientists who don't know why an object falls to the ground and who are driving around in all transportation powered by dinosaurs farting, excuse me, do not brag about your technology. It's crap. Okay? That's step one. To just get humble and get some perspective. Right. So what is our trump card? Our trump card is, in fact, the theme of this article I just wrote. It's called fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. And which is basically obvious as we're going, where we're going here with this is the physics of bliss, to make a charged radiant field that does give us leverage, which is bliss, what we're talking about, you know, follow your bliss, but the physics of why that makes us potentially powerful and why we have a capability for that, that those who would parasite us, not only can they not make bliss, but if we have an access to this bliss, this charged radiance, that it is literally toast for the parasites. We need to understand that physics in detail because it's our only trump card. And it is our only way to emerge from the imminent, disastrous danger of us falling into the trap that they fell into. The Greys, the Umites, they all fell into a machine-dominated Borg artificial intelligence culture. And believe me, that is a serious, serious problem. So when they're propagating this 5G and the Wi-Fi, all of the stuff that toasts your ability to have bliss and urging all your children to do all the things to destroy their aura, it is because they don't know what people are for and they don't even know what your trump card is, which is to get enough aura to have charged radiance to have bliss. So the reason it's called fusion in the blood, very briefly, is remember when Enki, Ra, Abraham, Osiris originally did the genetic engineering he called Tak Adama, we call it Adam and Eve. He called us Adam because that was the word for red, Adom, because of the iron in our blood, which he hadn't seen before, the oxygen transport mechanism. Remember the Draco, Uru, Anunnaki, running from the female-dominated Pleiadian culture, as Anton Parks well describes, and why every religion on this planet began with the fear of women, because they were afraid of women. That was a female dominated, as the Palladians are today. So what the iron blood enabled us to have that they couldn't, obviously I'm moving to the concept of fusion in the blood, which is bliss, is the fact that their blood was a lipid oil. McDonald's is perfect for them. Actually, Coca-Cola and French fries are the perfect meal for a Draco. If you have an oil-based blood, if you're breathing in nitrogen and breathing out cyanogen, your blood is an oil, and your bones are more carbon, and your nerves are more silica. Propagation velocities increase in that nerve, therefore higher frequencies in the Draco Uru brain waves, meaning more telepathy, but no low frequency in their EEG, meaning they can't get the Schumann, they can't do empathy. Okay, so they can't feel big things because they have no long waves and no theta, no alpha theta, which should be golden ratio in the brain, no implosion in the brain waves. So they don't have the capability for that bliss, that fire in the blood. And remember, when the Draco dominated, the guy was named Charlie at Montauk, dominated the human teenagers that they abducted to steer the time chair at Montauk. The guy was called the time empath, Michael Ash, I kind of knew him. They chose only the lucid dreamers. And when the Greys manipulated Eisenhower for the abductions and the Greada Treaty, they chose only the lucid dreamers, 90% indigenous blood people. Why were the lucid dreamers of value to them? Because they had that coherent enough aura to propagate in the longitudinal, which they could not do. We call it getting a soul. So once we understand how valuable it is to make the stuff in your aura that enables lucid dreaming and surviving death, literally bliss, suddenly we know what our trump card is.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So, with that explanation, it really clarifies that, from one perspective, we could say our purpose here is to cultivate bliss so that we can implode our blood, become immortal, shake the parasite, and save the world, in a sense.
And go through the heart of the sun, literally. Yes. To get a big aura.
What was that?
Yes. To get a big aura. Go through the heart of the sun.
Right. Beautiful.
Yes.
And this is something that, even a lot of the leading minds in the transformation of the planet to a better planet are missing. Right. So there's this, especially in the intellectual world, seems to be missing this bliss focus, this aspect of cultivating bliss. And, not only is this important, as you said, for us as individuals, but this is also important as a collective, and in order for us to come together. And I'd like for you to expand upon that when we go forward. But to come together and create collective coherency so that we can actually operate as more of a collective intelligence that is unified. So practically speaking, what can we as individuals do? Could you speak a little bit first about how this brings us together as a collective, this focus on being able to raise our JED, as you say, or implode our blood, increase our bliss experience, how this helps us as individuals, but then also how this helps us come together as collectives?
Well, that we do have an entire body of psychophysiology and biophysics literature on the brainwave biofeedback for bliss, flameinmind.com, where you can learn the golden ratio EEG alpha beta that implodes, and also the binaural triggerings that can go with that. So we have a lot of the physics of that, which we could discuss. But it's very appropriate that you focus initially on how this brings us together in the sort of collective boat to the underworld. And I think what comes to mind is the fun story of Akhenaten. Atun, remember, is basically sun god or Enki. And Akhenaten, apparently with Syrian motivation, if you believe the book God King Akhenaten by Daniel Stewart, who said, well, look, you got a job to do over there. Your job is to build this temple called Amarna or Amenti, which is an underground paramagnetic plasma accelerator complex, which is an evolution on the pyramid complex, which pyramid complex people don't understand, but is actually a plasma accelerator, which is basically how you accelerate your plasma into this solar heart, things like that, the real function of the pyramid. So the temple complex called Amenti Amarna that Akhenaten was assigned to build, which is a homework assignment he screwed up and he ran for his life and changed his name to Moses and became a gold powder cook and founded the Essenes. There's a lot of evidence on that. It's called Out of Egypt, Ahmed Osman, and the books on that, and even Lawrence Gardner came to agree. But the point was, why did they need a solar temple complex that could enable a soul group to have enough bliss together to lucid dream through the heart of their star? Basically, look, here are this fragment of a soul group stranded a long way from downtown, and they always have a war over where is the Stargate. You know, that's what Uru Asa LM, Uru, ancient dragon one, Asa queen of El, the place of the phase shift, implode into longitudinal. So Jerusalem, we know exactly what a Stargate is, and by the way, it's broken, so cancel the war. So obviously designing a solar temple that can be a plasma accelerator where a soul group, if they learn how to lucid dream together. So on day one, everyone cries for each other. On day two, they weep for each other, and then they laugh for each other, and finally they bond. You know, they have yoga and dinner every week for 5 years, and eventually they come to bond in such a way that they can replicably lucid dream together. And at that point, their collective coherence cocoon, leading Mother Nature's silver seed to a new home in the sun. The fact is, in physics, the plasma cocoon of an individual initially cannot gain the inertial escape velocity without the critical mass, without a group. And even Gurdjieff taught that accurately. No, the first bliss experience usually has to be a group experience because the individual, just as it doesn't have the critical mass of inertia, of charge to feel their own bliss. So they do a soul group, and eventually they can trigger their Kundalini by themselves. So the fact that the idea of a soul group goes together through the heart of the sun is a pretty good introduction to how this is a fusion experience. Also, the very nature of the physics of bliss, just like the coil in the plasma device, Therify.net, is that it implodes its environment. So never attempt, for example, to sustain bliss in a metal building full of electrosmog and bad air, because you're imploding poison, and bliss is implosion, just like the Therify is implosion, and every 0-point device that ever existed is implosion. So a soul group reflects the fact that bliss, by its very nature, is contagious and has critical mass, exactly like near-death experience, actually. So there's many reasons why this is a collectivizing experience. And in fact, as I've talked many times, our very concept of politics, which is our collective conventional notion of what group activity is, you know, current politicians need to know the definition of politics, and unfortunately they don't. The body polis is a very specific thing. It's the amount of plasma in your aura which is projectable. That's a body polis, which arises generally out of bliss. So, for example, a hive of bees cannot swarm until A, there's enough collective energy bliss, a body polis, to be plasma projectable. And then B, there needs to be royal blood, which is literally implosive DNA, present to make that plasma cocoon navigable. So now, what is politics? Politics is the physics of directing collective bliss cocoon. And the thing that's so cool about that, once you understand that, you know why collective bliss process is a threat to every government. Because by biologic definition, collective bliss replaces the need for and the function of government. And it should, and it needs to, if we're to survive. So in fact, what it means is every political decision needs to be based upon the physics of, does this help our people have bliss? Quite literally. So anyway, biological definition of politics.
Well, that's definitely yeah, I love that. You know, and you know, what's so inspiring about that also is that our purpose here on the planet is to have bliss experiences, both individually and collectively. And that's something that, you know, anybody would be excited to get behind, as far as I can tell.
A charge radiance. Yeah.
So,
yes.
Beautiful. So let me ask you then, what does this look like on an individual basis in your everyday life? How can somebody go about achieving the capacity to cultivate bliss in their everyday life? What kind of lifestyle decisions would they need to make? What kind of collective decisions? What kind of groups of people would they need to align with? And what kind of practices would they need to start practicing in order to start cultivating this ability?
Well, it's obviously the right question. The answer to that question is very old, and I don't have a new answer to that question. I have an old answer to that question. We know exactly what that means. That means generally you need to run from the city, or at least you need to run from electrosmog and metal buildings and Wi-Fi, and gives me a headache, and obviously this 5D and all this stuff. And, every ancient shaman that lived to be hundreds of years old, and it's well documented, every one of them did it in a cave, and not one of them ever did it in a metal building. And, oh, yes, Padmasambhava and John Trophimus, son of Magdalene, they melted the stone with their aura, and they needed to, and we know how they did it. So basically, it means that you're really understanding what it takes to grow your aura, which generally obviously means access to nature, access to grounding, access to live food. And to understand how insidious modern culture has become in destroying your aura, I mean, everything from chemtrails to the fact that almost all of the DNA in almost all of the food available at almost every store, especially the wheat, corn, and soy, has had so much monoculture that DNA is absolutely angry and should be, and will immediately induce mucus, which is the not self response. And so it means radical return to, live food diet and organics. And, are there nature spirits in that garden? And you asked your broccoli before you ate it, when was the last time you experienced genetic diversity? And this means that almost every grain available to you is not available. The Hopi blue corn, I saw the DNA of that ground.
And what you're saying here.
Go ahead.
And what you're saying here is that when food is monoculture, there's a lack of biodiversity, which is actually irritating to the DNA within the food. So you can imagine an individual being locked in a prison cell,
exactly.
Not having access to any other people, and how irritated that person would become.
Exactly.
And so this is what's happened to our food. And when we eat this food, this is the cause of mucus, and mucus is behind most diseases. So
yes.
Just to clarify what you're saying there.
That's exactly what it is. Yes. And I saw Grandfather Dan of the Hopi, the blue corn meal. I saw that cornmeal call the wind every time. And that was corn that would germinate specifically when you sang the right song to it. Extremely intelligent DNA. And it was a family pet, literally. Extreme genetic diversity. Unfortunately, the corn that's available to you today is the opposite. And that is the sickness. That is, right. And you're right, exactly. The monoculture creates, let's call it the Monsanto disease. It creates the literally angry DNA, right. That every child's grandfather for 100 generations has been in prison. That's the DNA that you're expected to eat. And of course, you have a mucus and anger inside you as a result. So and yet when we had an heirloom seeds. I used to tell the story. The Seneca Indians put an heirloom seeds garden at our farm in Eden, New York, and we had 7 different color beans and potatoes and tomatoes. All extreme genetic diversity, all indigenous heirloom seeds. And all of my friends, when they came together for dinner on the porch from that garden, reported this was better than LSD. This food, and the reason was because the plasma from those veggies was so psychoactive.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. So you're talking now about our connection to nature, and this brings up another question that I have for you. This is, I've heard of shamans and the way they sing their songs being a plasma projection of the topography of their particular ecosystem, and how a shaman from a completely different ecosystem can hear a song of another shaman and can actually see and experience the topography of the land that shaman lives from, which is indicative of their connection, their plasma connection to their ecosystem. So my question is, in regards to human birth as it is mostly experienced by humans today, the idea of C-sections. I was personally a C-section baby. And I've heard you speak of the disconnection that happens in C-section births of the baby with the plasma of their ecosystem. And I wanted you to speak a little bit on that, and then also if you have any solutions for being able to reconnect your plasma if you are a C-section baby, or just, as a human that feels disconnected to Earth, how can we scientifically connect ourselves to the plasma of the Earth so we can be connected with our ecosystem again?
Oh, it's beautiful thought and beautiful question and very important thinking. And yes, we spend a lot of time on that. In fact, I was invited to speak at conferences on the physics of rebirthing, actually. And I knew Joseph Chilton Peirce, who wrote The Bond of Power about the physics of the perfect bond between mother and baby. And the physics is actually quite simple, that during birth, there is a appropriate squeezing process where if you map the change in pressure over time in a well-evolved birth canal, it's the same as the change in pressure over time of the perfect measurable love hug, and which is a point of maximum pressure at 0.618 into the duration of that pressure waveform, in this case the birth canal, which is literally implosive, which provides an electrical fusion point, literally the perfect squeeze, which allows memory to be sorted at that point of maximum pressure, which is the physics of rebirthing, obviously, which is where the positions of the stars at that moment can potentially be fused into the DNA if that pressure experience is appropriate. And obviously underwater birthing helps perfect that, because the rate of decompression as you emerge from that is so critical, as every sacrocranial practitioner knows, and why underwater birthing has been documented to produce dramatic increases in IQ, for example, and balance and many things. So it is about a geometry of pressure, obviously, and the short answer to your question, of course, is the physics of profound rebirthing therapies, which are well evolved. John Diamond, used placental extract, the belly of a surrogate woman, deep breathing, and all of which, and underwater, and all of which is designed to imitate and recall that moment of maximum compression. And if those compressions have implosive symmetry, suddenly memory pops in, because the implosion of charge comes into phase sorting or negentropy. And so, the physics of rebirthing is obviously teachable in that regard. And lastly, since your story of those shamans evokes the memory of the songline and dreaming track, of how the Aboriginals treated your story of how the shamans sing together, which is beautiful. I would recall we spent a lot of time in Australia with the Indigenous and did gatherings there. I have many friends. So their story they tell is that the Aboriginal woman, who by the way is called a genie, which is from the Draco, and their marriage laws come from Draco in Aboriginal culture. For example, women and men have different languages. And so the woman feels something in her womb for the first time, which is to say now she knows she's pregnant. She runs to get the shaman and says, "The baby just leapt in my womb." And the shaman says, "Oh, quick." And they get out a stone and they paint a picture on that stone of the shape of the magnetic lines they call songline dreaming track, of the exact place where the woman first felt the baby leap in her womb. And that stone with that painting then becomes the title deed to the land that child is assigned to their lucid dreaming, to enable that land to be held together, to inhabit. Inhabit literally means to inspire with breath, And so suddenly, take responsibility for the magnetic line where you felt that implosion, and suddenly this is your lucid dreaming assigned territory. And if you do it right, then the rains will return, et cetera, et cetera. So it fits your story beautifully.
That's beautiful. Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. I think I heard you mentioning something about that before, and that was what inspired the question that I just asked. So you were speaking about how you didn't really have any new techniques for imploding the blood, because this is, ancient spiritual knowledge. So then that brings me to another question about Kundalini, and the idea of different schools of Kundalini. So there's different past. There's bottom-up Kundalini. There's top-down practices like Kunlun. There's heart-based practices, some that are taught in Rosicrucian mysticism. Do you have any preference for any of these different kinds of practices, or any that you would suggest maybe are more appropriate for specific types of individuals or humanity at large? And could you point people in the direction of the kinds of practices that you feel would be most beneficial for learning how to cultivate this bliss experience, rise the Kundalini, and implode our blood?
Well, first of all, it's true that I said, the techniques for bliss that I have to teach are old, but the knowledge of the physics of bliss gives us new tools to measure success. For example, flameinmind.com. And our biofeedback applications, flameinmind.com and iThrive.com, ITHRVE.com, are very good at measuring the sacrocranial spine liquid pump frequencies, which obviously are the mechanism of Kundalini. And it's true, I've spent 30 years teaching the physics of Kundalini. My mentor was Ben Benthoff, who wrote the book Stalking the Wild Pendulum on the biomechanics of Kundalini. And I've become, in some ways, one of the leading teachers of that science. And that's all at goldenmean.info/Kundalini. It's been part of our work for many years. And yes, I have some pretty detailed opinions about how that works. First, so a bit about the physics. The physics appears to be that if the best of cellular metabolism produces the excess cloud of ultraviolet coherence called blue fire, which is the sex juice, and when that's normally pumped up the spine liquid, it's called getting horny because it creates a phonon cascade in the ventricle liquid horns of the brain, actually, which coheres them with a phonon columnation, which, in that sense, being horny was the statue of Moses and Lucifer. It was just meant Kundalini. Doesn't mean good or bad, but it definitely describes a physiology which is plasma projective. And what Benthoff worked out, and to some extent I was there, was that if you took a capacitive accelerometer, which is basically plates of capacitor above and below your seat in a chair, you can measure the low frequency components of that and prove that this is the phonon wave causing your spine liquid to pump. And this is, we know now from Upledger's work, the phonon harmonic power spectra of the sacrocranial pump, which recently I proved, in fact, fits my equation for the physics of the origin of biologic negentropy. If you take Planck times exact integer x1 golden ratio, you actually, among many things, as you in my book on origin of biologic negentropy have proven, predicts almost all biologic negentropy. But it also predicts, your breath, your brain waves, and the tidal frequencies of the spine liquid pump, which is literally Kundalini. Remember, Upledger proved if your spine liquid is pumping, it is clinically impossible to be depressed. And oh, by the way, the ultimate solution to addiction. And so the EKG, the way we control that, it was the heart rate variability is our breath, obviously, which is yogis have known for years, and now it's very measurable. And we have the breath training well evolved at iThrive.com to teach the right breath to make the Mayer wave, which is the most important of the lowest low frequencies, 0.1 hertz, most important frequency of the blood, which is the natural resonance frequency of the blood pressure, which is a center point of the spine liquid pump frequencies. So it is a snake going up your tailbone. and when it explodes, what happens is that ultraviolet coherence cascade is pumped like a nectar from the mouth of the snake brain, feeding the bird brain. And the serpent feeds the eagle, and Quetzalcoatl is returned. And we've told this story of the physics of Kundalini many times. One pretty neat aspect of it is that we were there when our friend Bob Dratch measured the physics of Kundalini as well, and our friend Wendy Thacker in Boulder. And in fact, by scanning the spine for the exact frequency, 1.91 angstroms of adenosine diphosphate, the most important molecule in the body, ATP, and that's quantum distance is the step ladder for every storage of energy in every cell in the body. And if you measure the emergence of that microwave coherence from the spine, you can graph the presence or absence of Kundalini and actually make a map of the history of biologic trauma in your spine. And the same microwave scanner, which should replace every hospital scanner except the military stole it, is the ultimate geobiologic tool to measure Earth energy lines, which are profoundly symbiotic to human biologic microwave. So when we know the not just the phonon and the microwave, we know the whole broad spectral EEG to EKG to HRE to microwave to phonon of the Kundalini mechanism. So what's coming out the top of your head, which is, I had experienced many, many years, it feels like a red hot poker, and it's a burning fountain, and it affects many things. It can cause headaches and people around you, and it can cause rain. And in my case, it triggered a fair amount of clairaudience and hearing ancestor voices and the siddhis. And so, yes, it's a bliss mechanism, and it's extremely rapid ride toward evolution, and it's probably why I can talk fast, as I often joke. But it's also potentially life-threatening and very dangerous, and generally diagnosed as forms of mental disease, including schizophrenia, unless it's well understood, as Benthoff did. But it is necessary implosion, and it is certainly an indicator of the possibility of rapid evolution, and necessary. And so, yes, breath mechanism. So back to your question then, techniques, top down and bottom up. The heart-centered approach obviously would be the safest, I would suppose. But actually, we know you can measure it everywhere from the phonon to the brainwave to the microwave to the heart rate variability, and it's teachable in any one of those spectra. But better done under a tree than in a metal building, obviously. So, Kundalini is something that is a necessary step for human evolution. And it is basically simply metabolic density. It's simply plasma density. That's all it is. At first, I cried for 6 months straight. Literally weeping every morning, driving to work. You're crying. You call it tears of bliss, but it was tears. And what you're doing is you're sorting every memory that was not shareable to the point of distribution, which is exactly how you need to prepare for death as well. So yes, it's a near-death experience.
And now, what do you mean when you say a memory that's not shareable? What do you mean exactly by that?
Well, biophysically, what I mean by that is because the centerpiece of the DNA ladder rung is the fractal implosiveness of the hydrogen bond itself, and the DNA recursive braiding, long-wave phonon cascade imploding, which is the physics of bliss, braiding DNA, is how you get a soul. So that DNA can be described very accurately as a mechanism for imploding a longitudinal field effect library, sometimes called collective unconscious or ancestral memory, which is the library of survival information. Simple. And if you serve that, then you serve what DNA has been doing for 1 billion years. And if you don't, you won't get through the squeeze called death or bliss. So the necessity of preparing for bliss or death is the same, which is to take every memory that, for example, a memory that evokes anger obviously is not going to survive compression very well. And the cliche story told many times is, you put the charge imploder on a king called the royal crown, and it implodes the capacitance of his brain, and his thoughts speed up. And if the king is thinking shareable thoughts, his aura can then inhabit the land to the extent that he will control the rain. However, if that king is angry when you put the crown on him, he will go insane faster. So he is learning how to become shareable very quickly. So implosive compression is a test for getting a wave shareable, absolutely. Which is, shareability is the fractality of charge distribution perfected.
That's beautiful. So, this makes me think of it as virtue is infinite. Virtues are infinite. And the more we inhabit ourselves with virtuous essences, the more infinite we become.
And the practical example that we've been teaching for years has become almost cliche when I invented the concept of heart coherence by inventing how to measure it with a second order power spectrum called the Cepstrum. And originally that was my heart tuner, and HeartMath Institute really did not get it right, but they're wonderful. But now we have it far more accurately in our new tech. It's called realheartcoherence.com. And so you take 2 EKGs and you're measuring, let's say it's a couple, and we noted that you can replace a lie detector and replace kinesiology of muscle testing by simply measuring the internal phase coherence of the EKG. So, and this is simply a wave that goes up and down. You can see it at realheartquiz.com. And it's a beautiful lie detector, and it's a perfect way for a lady to decide when he said, "Will you marry me?" to see whether he was telling the truth, because it will tell you. So it's a joke, but it also works, you know. So how is that a lie detector physiologically? And what it is, obviously, what we're calling the climax form of coherence is the charge distribution enabled by having a wave be literally shareable. And, you know, the practical way to understand that is everyone knows that when you're looking in the eyes of your used car salesman, that if he blinks, you got a problem. You know? And the physics of that is very instructive. It's called saccadic activity. That if you're blinking, then the brain waves are not phase coherent. Whereas if you're able to sustain absolute focus, the waves are literally shareable. So phase coherence in the EEG and the EKG is literally a measure of pure intention as physics, precisely because that is what is a shareable wave. And the climax form of coherence, obviously, is the compression called fractality or phase conjugation.
That's so beautiful, right? You know, and you know, this really brings, as we were talking about the story that this adds. I mean, so now we're seeing the significance scientifically of coherent emotion,
exactly,
and how important it is to cultivate coherent emotion. You know, and this has been taught in ancient mystic traditions for, you know, since time immemorable. These kinds of virtues, these virtuous truth, compassion, empathy, beauty, these kinds of things are in a sense our ticket to the stars, you could say, and literally they are scientifically, and this is what the science is showing us today. So go ahead.
And so and the other example that's instructive, and it's a story we've told many times, is that, you know, when you're watching a shaman steer a tornado, if you had a little clairvoyance, and you watch the bioplasmic streamers emerge from the shaman's body and embed, entwine, entangle, and then conjugate in the center of the tornado, and then you see the shaman is steering the tornado, and he's provided the center of lowest pressure, which every physicist knows is how tornadoes are steered. But if you ask that shaman what he's doing, he says, well, I'm eating the hucha, which is I'm consuming the anger, which is to say I'm choosing empathy to feel the pain of that tornado. Well, how does a tornado get pain? Well, it's the same way you do. You know, the only pain you feel is the love you withhold. Well, it's more accurately, pain is the charge bleeding of fractality broken.
Okay, so this is important here. This is important here. Go continue.
Well, yeah. So the tornado feels pain when it passes over a metal city. And the tornado goes out of its way to destroy a metal trailer park, and it should, because the plasma implosion is not possible there. So that's called pain for that tornado and your body. And the tornado should go out its way, as it does measurably, to destroy metal buildings. Whereas a tornado will not ever destroy a sacred stone temple, because that does not feel like pain. So when that shaman felt the pain of the tornado, that tornado, just like you, knows that it's implode or die. So choosing empathy to feel, to embed, and embeddability perfected, sometimes called entanglement, is actually perfected in phase conjugation, charge implosion.
Beautiful. Now, I think that what you're saying here is really interesting and important also, because I feel like in the conscious community, or a lot of people that might be interested in this kind of conversation, there can sometimes be an idea that that it is detrimental to feel the pain of others. So where is the boundary on empathy, as far as what's a healthy amount of empathy? Because, you know, at a certain point, to tune into the pain of the world or each individual all the time, when does that become destructive, and when does that actually constructive?
That's the right question. You know, if you're walking past a mountain or a river, and that mountain or river as plasma sees that you have pure intention, it will send its plasma to you, because that is a way for it to immortalize itself. Or the tantric gaze, for example. So, you know, everyone that has pure intention is functionally a path to charge implosion, therefore immortality, which tells you who can deliver ghosts and who cannot. in practical terms, it means this is an instruction in why not to fall in love with metal buildings, for example. Because if you try to embed yourself in implosion, the only thing that's going to happen is you're going to dissipate your aura. So in effect, this tells you that you should embed your aura, only in that which will increase the centripetal inertia of your aura, which is to say those others who have pure intention, or those others whom you are very, very, very clear that you can help. Otherwise, it's a waste of your aura, quite literally. So this means, adiabatically speaking, energy efficiently speaking, that you choose to invest your love only in those who can receive it. So someone who does not love themselves will respond to your love with destruction, self-destruction, actually, because if they don't love themselves, there's even been research done, I think Bob Dratch helped us do that sending love chemically sends reactions to completion, for better or for worse. So, for example, when children send love to trays of seeds, it's been well measured many times, children send love to trays of seeds, dramatically accelerates germination. We understand the physics very well, good books on that, it's good stuff. But this is why you should not send your love to that which is not ready to receive implosion, because it is not ready to achieve compression or distribution. So love literally means long wave phi ratio, low phi perfect embeddability. It's more than Playboy magazine. It's about readiness to achieve the fusion and perfectly shareable wave that's required for pure intention. So that's why we say, ultimately, you only fall in love with pure intention. And everybody's running around looking for what they want to fall in love with. And what they're actually looking to fall in love with is the possibility of pure intention, because that's a roadmap to the immortality that comes from charge implosion.
Beautiful. Great. Yeah, I think that's a great understanding to have, just to where to put your energy, because it's going to expand in that direction, definitely. Okay, so let me ask you what, now when I think of collective bliss experience, I think of like an indigenous ceremony, or I think of a group of people that are music always. I'm a musician. Music always comes to mind when I think of that. How have you experienced, and how do you think we could imagine collective bliss experiences? I know that there's the connection point where people come together to the point where they're feeling empathy and they're laughing and crying together to develop that bond. But in a way that people could remember or identify, what is a collective bliss experience like? What does that look like?
Well, we've often joked that culture is not the color of your wine or your shoe polish. Culture is whether you have the skill to teach your children how to have bliss experience. And when I was young, the memories that come to mind is basically learning sacred dance. I learned Sufi dance, and then sacred gymnastic, Gurdjieff gymnastic, and then later we taught the Castaneda Tensegrity sacred gymnastic as well. And the physics of sacred dance is really quite clear, and it's an excellent path to collective bliss. The physics revolves around something called the rhythmic traverse, that if you're living on flatland and you'd like to know what a cube is, you have to do the rotations in phase that enable you to do data sampling on what it is to have a cube passing through flatland to know what a cube is. Then you could leap up to the next dimension. So the literal physics of ascension that's associated with rhythmic traverse, a sacred dance in phase, the music as it were. And the movie Meetings with Remarkable Men, at the end, we saw the sacred gymnastic of Gurdjieff, which was my background, Gurdjieff gymnastic. They say the celluloid of the film was actually burnt with the physics of bliss during the filming. It was so strong. And the collective bliss is amazing there. It's very powerful. And it's a great way for young people to actually learn the physics of bliss. So that would be one example, the music and sacred gymnastic, that enables basically the physics of grace is the ability to move in a geometry that embeds a long wave and a short wave. So the quality of grace required to accrue implode charge in movement, taken to its logical climax in sacred gymnastic, is a perfect introduction to bliss process for young people, for sure. And every tradition has done that, for sure.
Okay, beautiful. So then you see where practices like qigong or tai
Absolutely.
chi and
Yes.
and yoga come into play, because this is that sacred movement. Beautiful. So then let's see. What I would like to ask is on the practical side for individuals in their daily life. Say, for example, somebody may live in a city. Is it hopeless for somebody in a city, or is there a way of biohacking their environment to salvage their immortality?
It is getting increasingly difficult, I think, surrounded by Wi-Fi and 5G and electrosmog and bad air and metal buildings. It is very, very difficult, I think, actually. Now, there are certain examples here. When we wrote that article on the physics of pain, where we proved that pain is basically charge bleeding due to fractality, that's broken compression, that's frustrated. The co-author there, his name was, he was an anesthesiologist at New Jersey Institute of Technology, I believe, and he had done the experiments whereby placing a sacred stone circle around the operating table in a medical theater, he had documented a dramatic reduction in average surgery recovery times to typical surgeries like appendicitis, etc. So the number of days it took to recover from typical surgery was dramatically reduced if that person on the operating table was in the center of a sacred stone circle. Hello, what's the physics? Obviously, the anesthesiology benefited from a charged bubble that enabled the plasma of the person receiving the anesthesiology was able to remain more embedded and centripetal in the person under surgery. So it's very simple. You need a charged cocoon. Well, that's obvious. And a sacred stone circle, so every bedroom should have a bit of an altar. That's, and what are the altar materials? They're high dielectric material, organic materials, which implode capacitance, shungite, et cetera, et cetera. So, it is possible to make a charged cocoon. And for example, actually, another interesting example would be Patrick Bauty, our flamingmind.com programmer, where we're measuring sacred space and electrosmog with the same brainwave technology, measured the fact that if you implode the plasma of a room, we did this in Paris, with a Therify, so that, the room is ringing with this plasma imploding and people are kind of buzzing. But you can measure for a dramatic number of minutes after it's turned off that the local electrosmog is dramatically reduced. So, if you have a good implosive bliss moment in a room, you will leave a shadow behind you where electrosmog is reduced. So if you had a really loving family, eventually you make a bit of a cocoon, which is okay. But, sometimes you walk on water and sometimes you take a bridge. If your environment is highly electrically polluted, that's only going to last so long before you're going to need to be recharged by nature.
Right. And it's getting worse and worse. And this is the issue, with the 5G rollout that's coming along. So let me ask a couple questions. I want to move into 5G here in just a second, a little bit more specifically. But let me ask, you mentioned stuff about dietary choices, eating whole foods, eating foods that are, ideally you'd be growing your own food in a
live food,
in an organic environment. Now let me ask, there's a lot of PEMF devices out. One that comes to mind is the Beamer mat. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I'm wondering what your take is on some of these PEMF devices and just EMF devices in general that do things like increase blood flow and whatnot.
Well, every single pulsed electromagnetic field attempts to do what is charge implosion, which the perfected charge implosion will be the perfected negentropy, and that's the physics that we've been teaching for years. So the physics would be that the more broad spectral and the more phase accurate the pulse harmonic series, the more implosive. For example, Lakowski, Prairie, and then Therify.net all got the frequencies from the same source, and they ended up tripping over becoming very close to what eventually is my equation, which is the precise accurate pulse electromagnetic series to make implosion perfect, literally to make the two opposing pine cones kiss nose accurately. That's the physics, clearly, of rejuvenation and negentropy. Now, when Lakhovsky did it, he actually ended up using golden ratio harmonic series, but he didn't note it needed to be phase locked to Planck by golden ratio. But he got a lot of information from Rife and Tesla. So the point is, when Priory took that, he added plasma. So he added an optical and a high frequency radio frequency component, triggering the plasma. And so the climax is when you do that very broad spectrally and then very phase accurately. So logically, it's simple. The more broad spectral the pulse harmonic series, and the more accurately conjugate it is from 180 degrees out of phase conjugate. And even Lakhovsky got that right. He had two opposing, and he had golden ratio. But he did not have broad spectral. There was no ultraviolet, there was no optical, and there was no RF component, no high frequency RF. So
now is that damaging if it's not optimized that well, or is it just not as good?
It is our view that the Lakhovsky devices are useful, actually, and there was some pain reduction. And a variety of the professional full-time Lakhovsky practitioners in France have tried our Therify.net plasma, which takes that principle and makes it far more powerful and far more broad spectral and far more phase accurate. And every single one of those Lakhovsky practitioners said the same thing. And they're right. They said the Therify feels like Lakhovsky, but far more powerful and lots faster. Very simple, because it's more accurately implosive. So they were all trying to approximate the pure principle. But now that we know what the pure principle is, we're a lot closer to making it precisely thread that pine cone.
Okay, beautiful. Beautiful. So now I think the 5G is a good one to tackle. How about, can you tell us a little bit about what 5G does, the physics of what 5G does to the consciousness of humanity, and then what steps can be taken to, and you also mentioned, having an altar or whatnot, but what steps can be taken to reverse some of the damage that has been done to individuals? Because I know, personally, I can feel it. I feel it. I've lived temporarily in certain areas that have been, heavy electrosmog, and it affects my neurological function.
Absolutely.
And it's like discernible. It's like clearly discernible. I can feel it, and my memory starts to degrade. Exactly. And so, how would someone like me work to regain some of the memory loss and the neurological function that has been dissipated from these harmful technologies?
Yeah, that is the critical question, and it's a tough question. First of all, I'm not an expert. I should be in the physics of 5G, but it's basically broad spectral scattering of the efficient RF. So not only are the radio frequencies fields higher frequency, but they're broad spectral and they're scattered. Scattering achieves communication efficiency, but unfortunately it achieves also more biologic destruction. So, and the people who invented it do not know.
It's the opposite of coherence.
Exactly. It is literally moving far in the direction of the opposite of coherence. So, people who invented it do not know what life is, do not know what life is for, do not know what causes a seed to grow. I mean, this is, I would say, evil, actually. And it reminds me, in Italy, we're traveling around Italy doing lectures, and increasingly the Italian government was putting the microwave towers in the church steeples and the schools without telling the people, really. And you could just feel the insidious brain fog spreading like a cancer. It's horrible, really. It is sad news. Now, our friends in Italy, for example, were experimenting with some suggestions a friend Ananda made with which a copper oxide in certain paints, which can have a small but useful effect of shielding. And there are many, many devices and blankets, et cetera, et cetera. I would remind you, however, that no matter how efficient a Faraday cage, ultimately the Faraday cage is the opposite of bliss, because the frequency signature, which defines bliss in brainwaves, is precisely the equation of the harmonic cascade that is the Earth's Schumann harmonics. So the reason bliss works,
Right.
the alpha beta of your brainwaves, the golden ratio, is because you're imploding the Schumann harmonics of the radio of the planet itself.
Right.
So a Faraday cage, by definition, is the opposite of embedding in the Schumann. So hello, Faraday cages are not the answer, they're the problem. So ultimately,
right. So, and is there any way of say artificially generating a Schumann resonance so that you would still have access to it while inside a Faraday cage? And this is what they do in the spaceships, right?
well,
And does that work?
well, actually, you know, we now know how to correct the Schumann harmonic cascade because my equation predicted what the Schumann harmonics are or should be more accurately. So we know how to make the perfected Schumann harmonic, which is exactly the low frequency harmonic cascade we feed to the modulated plasma in Theraphi. So we are absolutely making the perfected Schumann in the plasma of Theraphi.net. Now, and it is bliss, and in fact, 30% of the women who are able to relax report some kind of bliss experience and sharpened vision in that kind of plasma. And I'm not saying it's the ultimate solution, but it's fun and effective and useful, and it's a good taste, you know. But to get to your question, you know, I think if you have to go into the city, you need to regularly be able to return to your place of power where you can, again, embed and get to that inner stillness. And probably that's going to be a place where you're able to where you're able to embed yourself in nature, actually. So if you are forced to live in a city, you need a place in nature you can go to regularly to recharge your batteries. It's obvious and it's simple, but it's important physics. So yeah. And all of the devices out there that provide a small amount of shelter. For example, shungite. Shungite, like the Kaaba stone of the Muslims that was ground up to be the projective powder philosopher's stone, is an implosive capacitance. It was a meteoritic glass with vaporized gold through it, which is also how they made the red glass of the stained glass windows. These are examples of phase conjugate dielectrics, implosive capacitance like shungite. Now, the key that you could measure that is very high dielectric constant. What that means is efficient capacitance. What that means is ask a phase conjugate optics expert how you make a phase conjugate mirror, because you want to know how Nostradamus did it, and you'd like to know how John Dee did it in his Showstone. Well, Nostradamus and John Dee made a phase conjugate mirror. That's what they did. And you ask a phase conjugate optics guy who's documented time reversal and negentropy, it's been measured, it's conventional physics, what makes a phase conjugate mirror works. He'll agree barium strontium titanate is a super high dielectric constant, but he will not know why that material makes a phase conjugate mirror work, when in fact we do now know. If you get a material science, which is super charge distribution efficient, which is the name of what high dielectric constant means. It when the insulator and the capacitor, you're measuring the efficiency of the distribution of charge and called dielectric constant. So you ring it like a bell. If it rings forever, it's a high dielectric, which is the physics of the Gurdjieff movie, you know, the Sufi can make the perfect echo. The perfect echo is immortality defined, and the perfect echo is named high dielectric constant, which is why you need biologic materials in your house so your aura can propagate, which is what organic materials are because they got fractal instead of getting dead. So the phase conjugate mirror, the super high dielectric constant, like the shungite, like the coating that Nostradamus put on the bottom of his scrying cupped water mirror, was a phase conjugate mirror, which means implosive capacitance, which means the plasma could implode, which means that permissive distribution of charge allowed the pine cone's charge compression lines to converge permissively, accurately, all the way down to the Planck threshold. And that's what enabled the longitudinal embedding, which is the perfect phase conjugate mirror, therefore the perfect scrying, therefore how Nostradamus did it, now John Dee did it with his Showstone, and actually the Huesca Indians of South America, they all built phase conjugate mirrors. That was what they were up to, this implosive charge. And these materials are able to powerfully reduce electrosmog as shungite does because of this implosive capacitive quality.
Okay. So yeah, shungite's a big one. Yeah, and then so we have shungite, and then and what other materials would you recommend also?
Well, actually massive structures of biologic materials in general. So large straw bale, large wooden houses, for example. So if you have large masses of biologic material, even stone or even fabric, so large masses of biologic materials in general, whatever they are, will have high dielectric constant and will be implosive and will dramatically reduce electrosmog for sure. So, a big, heavy, thick wooden or straw bale or natural biological material or natural stone house will have its own charged cocoon, because to a large extent, that which is implosive prevents that which is not shareable from penetrating. It means the reason bliss will prevent parasites in your stomach and in your aura is because nothing which is not shareable can penetrate the center of charge implosion. So, which is why bliss is so good for, sorting parasites. And so if your house is thick and heavy and made of all biologic material, it will dramatically reduce waves which cannot phase conjugate because they won't make it through that implosive material, high dielectrics. Which, Steiner was teaching. He taught that the kids should only touch living materials, living fabric and, stone and wood. And that if a child touches metal or plastic, it literally reduces their aura because their aura cannot propagate through it. So they cannot inhabit the space. And so it's been well documented in Finland now, when the kids take off their shoes and get grounded, the education process was reinvented. It was beautiful. So that's the book Earthing in Practice.
Beautiful. Yes, I'm a big student of Rudolf Steiner. I feel like he brought so much through, and I think, so he talked about, I think the way he described it is the human body being a kind of resistor to the prana energy, and as the prana energy moves through the physical body, that the electromagnetic field around the physical body is like a that's like a decay of the prana energy moving through. Is that how you understand it?
Well, Steiner was overly imbued in the Christian metaphor, and as a result, a lot of the Steiner people today are sort of Luddites. They are resistant to physics. But what Steiner called, he had beautiful insight because of his clairvoyance. But what he called etheric formative force and projective geometry clearly is capacitive charge projection lines. And even as orgone is basically capacitive implosion. So etheric force gone biologic is clearly charge implosion. And so their study of projective geometry was a study of charge implosion, clearly. And we always tell the story we learned in Australia from the Steiner schools there that, Steiner taught that the children, if they learned to draw the sequence of a rose unfolding accurately enough that they could visualize the rose opening so clearly when they would close their eyes, the test for when the classroom of children had succeeded in visualizing the rose blossoming inside was that the room would fill with the smell of roses. And we understand the physics of that very well because the flowering brain is literally the infrared. Oh, wow. The infrared mechanism of olfaction that Callahan proved is literally the flowering brain, which is why we had this lady friend in Marshfield. She had so much bliss, and the hummingbirds in midwinter, the house is sealed, and the hummingbirds kept smashing into the window. They could obviously smell her bliss through the window, sealed house in midwinter, because the infrared went through the window. And so Steiner had many, many useful insights there. And but again, we turn that into science; it becomes more shareable.
Beautiful.
Oh, by the way, our Steiner School curriculum you could read at goldenmean.info/Steiner, where we tell some of those stories.
Beautiful, beautiful. That's awesome. So what are some things that that the average person can do to help humanity with all of this information? So we understand that cultivating bliss experience is the cornerstone of purpose for humanity. And that it involves bliss in groups of people, so collective bliss and individual bliss cultivation. And how can this understanding inspire some activities that we can do to be of most use for humanity? Obviously, spreading the word, getting the education out there. Is there any other angles or any other directions for how the average person can be of most service to humanity?
Well, I would always say, if you can teach young people how to grow their aura, the simple practicalities of growing your aura. So, for example, removing the metal from your body, the jewelry, the steel in your belt buckle, natural materials, wearing as little clothing as possible, and the best biological material you can find, light, airy clothing, learning the deep breathing techniques, learning to always find the place of power in the room, learning to always have charged air in the room, never, ever occupy a room full of dead air for any longer than you absolutely have to, because the capacitance of the air is the most important thing for your aura. So there's all these very, very practical things you can do to learn how to carry your aura with you when you go, and learning how your aura is so insidiously destroyed in airplanes and cars, and working at trying to keep your aura when you're traveling, which requires work. So all these things that it takes to carry your aura with you when you go, these are the practicalities that need to be taught to young people urgently, among other things. Yes, exactly.
Okay. So there's a lot of small details in as far as you could call them aura hacks, like we call them, to be able to amplify your aura. So where can we find more of a detailed expression of all of these different hacks? Do you have a website that goes into detail about all the subtleties?
Well, my second book, called Implosion: Secret Science of Ecstasy and Immortality, is also known as Conscious Kids. And it's the PDF. It's beautiful, a fun book, goldenmean.info/conscious kids. And you'll see the PDF for that book. And it portended to be a book for teenagers who wanted to know what bliss is and how to get there, literally the hygiene for bliss. So the book starts out with the premise that the adult is respecting the teenager for willing to risk their lives to get a bliss experience. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, whatever it takes, your teenager requires a bliss experience. And suddenly the parents are saying, I'm respecting my teenager for willing to risk their lives to have bliss, because in fact, if they don't get bliss, they are toast. So now what we do is we get in alignment with our teenagers, say, yes, you need bliss experience. Absolutely. So we're going to help you get to have a bliss experience. And then we go into the hygiene and the dance and the food and the diet and the environment. Basically, we divided into 4 categories. One was environment. We just talked about living material. And the other was diet, live enzymes and all that stuff. And the third was the psychology, that every thought you think that is shareable attracts charge. So there's the whole psychology that you only think shareable thoughts. And every time you think a shareable thought, your hair stands up. And that's the physics of implosive capacitance, literally eureka. And as you learn to think only pure principle, then every thought you have immortalizes you. So you get the idea. There's a psychology, there's an environment, there's hygiene, there's an architecture. So you put these in categories and you design a hygiene for bliss. And that's what that book intends.
Oh, that's beautiful. What a great resource. Thank you so much for putting that out. Now, a quick question that came as far as environment is, so you say, having the charged air. So is a sky full of chemtrails, is it a good idea to open your windows there? Is there more charged air outside or inside if you're in a house when there's chemtrails outside?
It's funny. In South France, I noticed that we don't have as many. We're kind of lucky. But I did notice when there's a bunch of chemtrails, you can actually watch the tops of the trees wilt. You can actually watch as the precipitant comes down. So it's serious. And all of the people with respiration problems get worse dramatically as the chemtrails propagate. And that's real. Now, whether chemtrails are an evil plot by an evil government trying to kill people, or that's a more complicated question, because in fact, they put aluminum in jet trails. It had to do with radar. It's a long story. It's highly poisonous. But the amount of aluminum in the soil in the northwest of America, for example, is disastrous. It's absolutely a disaster from the jet trails, et cetera, et cetera. So they are a very serious problem for sure. But whether they're insidious intention, bad intention, or whether they're simply stupidity, that's another question. But whether you open your windows, no, I would say if there's a bunch of chemtrails, you might want to keep them closed for a while and add a negative ion ozone generator and a few things indoors, and get a large number of plants indoors and do that for a couple of hours or days.
Beautiful, beautiful. Speaking of negative ions, have you been out to what am I forgetting? Not Croatia. There's a pyramid in Bosnia. Yeah. I forgot they were. Yeah. Have you been out to the Bosnian pyramid? What is your experience there?
Well, we've been working with Sam Osmanagic, who sort of invented the Bosnian pyramid, for quite a few years. And so we have an ongoing relationship, and many of our friends lead events there. Actually, one of them, Catherine, was with us today, who's leading events with Sam at Bosnian Pyramid. And Sam has been asking me to come for years. And Sam actually bought one of our Therify plasma devices because he really understood, why so many people were having rejuvenation experiences underground. And he even measured the power spectra of the low frequency phonon. It's called infrasound, which is now well known to be part of the important physics of how Pyramid and Sacred Dolmen create rejuvenation, and people come there for rejuvenation regularly. So he got it about that. So the physics is pretty useful. Now, in terms of the argument there, or whether it's man-made or not, it's complicated because, in fact, there are some natural formations. But you see, I kept telling Sam that is not even the important question, whether it's man-made or natural. That's not the important question. The important question is, to what extent was the electrical structure implosive enough to achieve rejuvenation and plasma projection? That's the important question. And the beautiful thing is that's measurable by power spectra. And we're actually now we're developing our biofeedback group is marketing some Russian copper pyramids where we could achieve this growth plasma projection. So what we'd like to think is that what should emerge from places like that is the ability to teach the physics of how you build the structure that does that. And that's what we're involved with for sure. Which you're right, negative ions is part of the manifestation. Negative ion is a small scale black hole. Obviously, negative ion wind is well medically documented to be profoundly therapeutic. So every hospital knows that negative ions are precious. Every hospital knows that. The negative ion wind side of the hospital always gets better healing. It's well documented. And we know exactly now, a strong negative ion wind can even burst spinal meningitis. It's so, eliminating of infection.
Wow.
And this is called cell care therapy. And the point I want to make, and I've made this many times, is the same physics of what keeps a negative ion alive is the physics of what keeps the plasma cloud of Therify alive. So, and the plasma cloud of Therify is basically a giant negative ion. That's all it is. It's a big one. It's the same physics. So it's implosive. And so hospitals now are aware that if they have electrosmog in metal structures, it kills the negative ions. And the same thing will kill the plasma of healing therapy. So by teaching what negative ion wind does, we actually learn how cold plasma works at the same time. And obviously pyramid structures that make strong negative ion winds are powerful indicators of that plasma implosion. So Sam is a sweet guy.
Awesome.
He's out there and he's ambassador. You like him.
Yeah. I've seen some of his stuff online. He's a
great guy. Great guy.
So are there any other important keys that you feel like we missed in this conversation, or anything that you want to insert that could help the average person that is new to this, to all of this information?
Well, I think fundamentally now to embrace the idea that physics adds to the beauty of spiritual wisdom in such a way that now the real path of spirituality is to embrace the physics that we can then teach our young people in such a way that we produce agreement. I've been saying this for years, it's cliche, but so important it bears repeating, that religion wars emerge because we have failed to teach our spirituality in a language that's shareable. As soon as we teach our spirituality as science, it's obvious religion wars are over, for sure. Mm-hmm. And then the disempowerment of personality in worship and miracle worship are over. I mean, the Catholic Church used to have a little bit of suggestion for how to get spiritually sustainable. However, after a couple hundred years, they were obsolete. It should be scientists that teach what spirituality is. And to be a priest, which is to help people with their aura, you need to be an electrical engineer, actually. So if you're not an electrical engineer, you can't be a good priest. Excuse me, I'm a little prejudiced, but. So now that we've learned that our spirituality is a beautiful science, we can transcend